Hello, everyone. Welcome back for another positive talk. Super excited about today's live, diving into politics again. If you haven't seen my episode that I did with Brian Sims, you should definitely check that one out because that was also another fun live that I did where we got to talk about politics. Figured since we're getting close to election day here in the United States, hopefully all of you that can vote early are voting early, but election day is coming up, so I thought I'd bring someone on who understands the importance of politics in rural areas. So I'm excited to have him on and have this conversation. See if we can get him on. Hello.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm good. How are
I
you?
am doing well. I've had 2 calls this morning already, so
Good.
my energy is here.
Good. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I will let you introduce yourself so people know who you are, and then we can dive into a conversation.
Yeah. So my name's Eric Wilson. I live here in Wisconsin, and I actually ran for one of the most competitive congressional seats in the nation this cycle here in the third district. Didn't make it through the primary, but um, that's okay. I think it's important that even if we hit hurdles, we are still continuing forward. And really, what drove me to run was we can't sit out this year. It's not the year.
Definitely
And
not.
I mean, we're a week away from the election, and it's we need to get everyone out because our lives really do depend on it, and how we kind of live our lives depends on us being engaged. So I've continued to be involved and really work in Wisconsin as much as I can to get people out who may not have or may not feel like they have a voice. So the work continues, but I'm excited to be here and excited to see where our conversation goes. I think there's a lot of topics that we can talk about and ready to dig in. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, awesome. And yeah, I love that when I asked you to come on and talk, you talked about the importance of like politics in rural areas because I was someone who grew up in a very rural area and being someone who in 2016 saw nothing but Trump signs. And then, of course, in 2020, there was a little bit of Joe Biden signs. And this time around, we went out to a corn maze this weekend to celebrate the holiday season of Halloween, and we were seeing lots of Harrison Waltz signs. So we were starting to feel a little bit hopeful, but you also have that tinge of seeing people online. I mean, yesterday was really intense, especially since my partner and his family are from Puerto Rico, and hearing the comedian talk about it as if it's just a floating island of trash
Right.
definitely was not fun to hear. But being someone who's grown up surrounded by very conservative minded people, I've navigated and had to have conversations with people, work with people who have very different opinions, and it's really important to know that it's okay to stand up for what you believe in, even though you may not be surrounded by people who think the same. And sometimes you have to take the step forward and have those uncomfortable conversations and educate people why you think differently and why maybe they should also shift their mindsets a little differently.
Yeah, and I think it's part of I do believe that we have left rural America behind. And it's gonna take a long time to change that perception. And for me, it was really I ran a campaign of showing up. And I was at every single event that I could be at. I had my team at every event because how we rebuild community is by showing up and spending time, and it's it's a choice, and I think we have to make the conscious choice to choose differently. And I think it's coming from a perspective of being an openly gay person in rural Wisconsin is an isolating thing at times. But it's also it only takes one person to stand up and be like it's okay,
Right.
and and that was part of a premise that I ran on, is like, regardless of what I have to go through and the hate that I have to go through, if I can make it okay for one person to feel comfortable being themselves, then it's worth that, because we have to look at this as not just ourselves in our current moment, but like, I might be the person that inspires the next person to run, and they might be the person. Like, we have to think of this as long as we're moving forward step by step, we're making progress. And it may not feel like it at times, but it's taking that kind of positive forward approach that I think is how we will, I guess, literally move forward. But I think it's, you don't have to win to win. And I think that's something that we have to think about as people are stepping up into the chaos, right? Like, it is brutal out there right now. And there's a lot of hate going around. And so it's very easy for people to just isolate
Yeah.
and be like, yep, I don't want to do it. But it's like, okay, well, grab a friend. Like, and I think there's different ways that we can do it, instead of just like, so we're canvassing for state assembly members, because if not sure, we have the national stage going on, but what we also have here in Wisconsin is an opportunity that we haven't had for 14 years. And that's the opportunity to actually have a state legislature that is reflective of our, I guess, our constituents. So we've had really, really bad gerrymandering here in Wisconsin, and so it didn't matter. Literally didn't matter. Like, and so there's a lot of people our age that have never voted actually in an election that was fair from a state assembly perspective. And so there's a little bit of a hope component to this as well. And I think it's taking that opportunity to actually have that representation. So we're getting out knocking doors. And one of my friends is running for state assembly actually, and what we've been doing is to get people more engaged or more comfortable with knocking doors. Is we just have gatherings of eight to 10 people, and we partner up and we go knock 10 doors, and then we come back and have snacks, and like, we we make it fun. And I think that's how we change it so it isn't so scary.
Yeah. I definitely think that empowering people and reminding them of their true ability to make change is really important, because I think it's really easy to live in today's world and see like presidential candidates. It's really easy to see celebrities and influencers online and think that those are the only people that have the ability to make change happen. But like change, the easiest change to make happen is local.
Mm-hmm.
Like those are spaces where one, you have the most ability to like make an impact because they're people that know who you are. And when it comes to everyone's focus on the president, like yes, that's a big seat to fill, but the local politics are also very important. Like from a very young age, like my dad would sit on the board of supervisors for the county we lived in,
Okay.
and I kind of grew up sitting in the background listening to adults talk about adult things. It wasn't until I got a little bit older that I realized some of that absorbed into me, and I was just like, you know what? And now I'm here in the capital of Virginia. So it's a lot more liberal, a lot more open minded, but there's still people having conversations where it's like, you know what? I'm going to put myself out there and be a resource for people who want to have the conversation, because we all know that when it comes to the algorithm, we very much so get put in an echo chamber, and we only hear the same rhetoric repeated over and over and over again.
Yep.
And it's important for you to realize that your neighbor who's got the Trump 2024 sign maybe has only heard the same message on repeat. And if you can have a conversation with them because you've built that relationship with them of respect, that they may hear it from you. Whereas me, someone who they don't know, saying something, I'm just kind of shoved to the side. So empowering people to understand, like, people in your local like counties and cities, like they see you show up. And I think that we focus so much online and we forget about the people that already see us as people who respect us
Hmm.
and will listen to us for at least a couple minutes before they might shut their ears off from what we're
Yeah.
saying.
Well, that's just it. It's like it's so easy to be a keyboard warrior. And I was reading through some comments. I went down a rabbit hole. If someone posted something, and then of course it was the typical back and forth on both sides, and neither are listening. And it's like that's the problem with a digital communication is it's much harder to feel, I guess, where the person is coming from. But when you're having in-person conversations, it's like there's a physical component of like, hey, you can feel it, I'm upset and like very passionate about this. And I think that's where having more of those in-person conversations is how we're actually going to change. And they're like, oh yeah, I see Eric go to the grocery store, he's a human. Like, I think it's we when you have the celebrity, it's like they don't do these things. But like when you're like, oh, you see them every day or once a week, whether that's at church or whatever community you're in, it humanizes everyone, and then it's less about like our differences and understanding like, hey, they actually care about. And I live in Eau Claire, so it's like they actually care about Eau Claire.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there have been several conversations that I've had within churches where it's it's almost like the LGBT community is a faceless community to people who are saying some really hateful, harmful things. Whereas when you start to put faces on them and you say, like, this law will impact Drummond this way, this
Mm-hmm.
law impacts Eric's life this way, it makes them humanize what's being said. Because I think that that's the big rhetoric that I see a lot of the conservative people doing is kind of painting over the humanity of these people that these laws are impacting and kind of painting us in a light of we're taking over things, we're stealing, we're removing other people's rights, we're taking people's guns. Like it's really easy to kind of paint over a group of people. But in local communities, it's a little bit easier for us to be like, hey, like this law impacts me this way.
Yeah.
Like these are my rights that are being removed. Would you want your rights removed in this way? Not saying that it's always the best way, not saying put yourself in harm's way uh, to try to get someone to understand. I think safety is the most important thing. But if it's just having an uncomfortable conversation, that's the problem. We, as people of communities that are heavily impacted by who's sitting in the offices, it's really important for us to push through those uncomfortable moments to just have those conversations because sometimes it's just about planting a seed so that
Right.
they have something to ponder on once you've ended the conversation and went your separate ways. It's not always like the end of the conversation they're like, well, I throwing away this red hat and I'm putting on the sunglasses and supporting Harris. But planting seeds can really make an impact. You may not see it, but that's why voting is so beautiful because people can vote however they want and it's private. So you might have changed a lot of people's opinions just by showing up and being there.
Yeah, and I've had that exact thing happen. It's like I've had a conversation with someone, and like what I like to do is ask questions, and because I'm a curious person, and I'm like, okay, so people got to where they're at somehow, and so it's like we need to understand that before we can try to communicate in ways that they might understand. And so it's like I was just asking questions to this person, and they kind of got a little flustered, and we ended the conversation. Um, but we actually ran into each other about 2 weeks later, and they were like, "I've thought about what you said, and like, I think you're right." And I was like, "Well, that's nice to hear once in a while." um, and then we had a bigger conversation about it, and like we were able to kind of respectfully challenge each other. And I think that's part of what we need to try to rebuild is like we are gonna have differences. Like if we all have the same mindset, we're in trouble. And so that's where on out having conversations with people like we're not gonna agree on everything, but here's where I stand and here's why I stand there. And I think there's a lot of respect that comes with that is like and one thing I'm proud of is I ran my whole race without changing a single stance. And so it's like here's who I am. You can like me or not. um and but at least they knew, and I think that's something that we need more of in politics is like it's okay to stand somewhere and have differences. What's not okay is to be demonizing each other and dehumanizing each other, and like we should be working on building like, and that's I think part of um where I'd like to see conversations start moving to is like how we have very different like very stark differences in our ideology in our country right now, and how are we going to like mend um where we're gonna go. And it's reminding and showing up and being like these are the things that we actually have in common. Like
Yeah.
we have more in common than we don't. And I know that gets said, but I think we need to really hit on that as we're out talking to people.
Yeah. And I mean, we have more in common with our local neighbors than we do with the politicians running for federal government seats as well. So it's like, don't destroy all your relationships in your neighborhood um, just
Because
because we're in a political
yeah,
year.
yeah, and I like the politicians aren't going to be the ones that are going to come shovel you out when you're stuck in a snowbank. Like
Yeah,
it's your
very
neighbor
true.
down, it's your neighbor down the road that's going to be like, oh, he's stuck. Like I'm going to go help him. And so
Yeah.
that like I think it's but we have this big blast of rhetoric. And from my personal experience, like I don't come from a wealthy background. I don't come from like a well connected or self funded campaign. It's like my campaign was very much grassroots, and there's a challenge within our system of younger people running, and there's a challenge in our system of like if you don't have a huge financial structure in place, it is very very difficult to run for any
Yeah.
level. Like, and I think that's something that we really need to look at within. And then it's also like campaign spending is out of control, um which we're seeing. And it's like what if we put that money towards fixing some of like the things that are impacting people in our communities, like homelessness, lack of health care, just basic infrastructure. I think we've like that's one that we've really got to change to get more representation in our government.
Yeah. I
I
mean,
know that's a whole can of worms, but
no, yeah. I was gonna say when it comes to so many things, like money almost, if you have it, it puts you at the top, which that's I think is a very dangerous thing because we've already got those one percenters that exists and control so much. I feel like there has to be some type of safeguard to protect the rest of the people of the United States from those people, a 1% group of people making the choices for the people that make up the rest of the 99% of the country. I think that it's really important for us to realize that. And I think that that's even when it comes to us supporting local businesses and existing in a I grew up with my grandfather saying like don't support the big box spaces. They make their money, they can sell things way cheaper because they can take the hit and nothing will happen. And so I put a lot of focus on, well, what's a local market? What's a local restaurant we can
mm-hmm.
go eat at? What can I do in this town that is going to support the economy here and not Amazon and these bigger places. But when you think about natural disasters and things, I mean, North Carolina just got hit. They're right under me here. We got a lot of flooding here in Richmond. The James River was coming up, and I there's been a definite like media focus on how different politicians are handling all of this right now. But if you zoom in a little further past the federal government, past the state government, you see people showing up. Like people
Yeah.
from all different states showed up in North Carolina to help. And I think that that's a beautiful way to realize that people show up for one another, even when the government may not. And I think the media also chooses to focus on whatever they think will get them the most ratings or views. They're not going to show the people that drove 8 hours to come down and they're giving out water bottles. They're going to focus on what Trump is saying, what Kamala is saying,
Yeah.
what the governor of North Carolina is saying. But it's important to remember like we as people have a lot of power to make change and help one another and get through this. But I definitely think that it's important for us to remember that some of the structures are not set for the everyday person to succeed, which I look at Tim Walz and I see a more everyday type of person. But when you like look at his history, he did have some things that other people didn't have access to, but
Hmm.
he's still showing up. And I feel like I'm hearing a voice of someone that I could see being the coach of my team in my small town here in Virginia. And it's kind of nice to hear someone like him speaking.
Yeah, and it's that's where I'd love to see some structural change around like how politicians have to show up. I think it it turns into you kind of get into your bubble when you're elected,
Yeah.
and it's like, okay, well, maybe there has to be like actual community service that our politicians or like, right, they're public servants. And so I think there's some regrounding that we could try to implement within our system. Um, and because I think it is important and it's a good reminder. And I think it also shows the community that these people are public servants and they are supposed to be representing us and
Yeah.
representing all of us. And it's one thing that I have been looking into doing here in Wisconsin post election is more organizing around marginalized communities. And I think there's a lack of there is a lack of infrastructure here. And I think it's a challenge that we have in rural areas. I can't speak to the rest of the nation, but I can assume that it's probably close to the same. Um, where it's you get left out of elections because you're only 1% of a vote.
Yeah.
And so people don't take the time to communicate or ask like what's impacting you. But what I'd love to be able to do is start doing some organizing, and all of a sudden we get to 7 to 10% of a vote, and then it's like, okay, we now have power to be influential, and you have to listen to what we need. And I think it's important to start with marginalized communities because they're most impacted by our current structure. And it's the lack of housing, it's the lack of jobs, transportation, healthcare. Like it's a true challenge. And it's like if we can everyone does better when we all do better when we all do better. Like I think is kind of a core statement of mine, and like it's true. We have to build from the bottom up, and we're having we're having a lot of like unhoused, and I say issues because it's structural and it can be changed. It's a choice that communities are making, um, and so I think we really need to focus on the ground organizing, um, and come with a request. Like, I think it's much easier to have a conversation when you're like, here's our problem, here's what we need. Um, like, let's start that conversation.
Yeah. I almost feel like government civil like civics classes in high school gave us the bare minimum of an understanding of how the government works and how we can utilize it to make the change we need in the world. Because there's definitely times where I've sat through board meetings where people bring stuff to the attention, like when it came to like Charlottesville, Virginia, listening because I worked for a tech company, hearing how much had to go in to get a cell tower put in a city. Like you hear all the citizens of that space complain about really shitty cell service, but then you go to like the board meeting where they're determining where they're going to put it and they're like, we don't want a tall ugly thing in our city. It's like those decisions impact you and you can bring those types of things to those people and start the conversation. And yeah, you might not get their attention right away. It might require you to do some research and work on the outside and bring more knowledge to the table to kind of push it onto them a little bit. But it's important for people to realize you do have the right to do that and you do have the
Absolutely.
power to do that.
Yeah. Well, and that gets into so one or another. So I'm a project manager by trade. So I've worked at some at big companies, and I've worked at Target. I worked at Cigna and Express Scripts. So health insurance, healthcare, I have a good understanding of, and have a lot of opinions on. Um, but one thing that I see at our federal, and even at our local, is like we pass these big bills, but then no one thinks about how to implement them. And I'm like, okay, you can have $1 trillion out there, but if no one has access to it and no one can actually implement it, you might as well have not written the bill. And
Yeah.
and so it's like what I'd love to see more of is the question of like, okay, we have the resources available. How are we going to execute this? And how like what layers because I think like you're saying our local government um, is actually the one creating the change and implementing some of these solutions, but they don't necessarily have the resources or access to, um, they don't have access to the resources to actually fix what needs to be fixed, or like the autonomy to, and it just kind of gets bogged down.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, another thing that I feel like our government has become is kind of like a performance stage for certain people. Um, I almost wish they would take cameras out of like the House of Representatives and the Senate spaces just because I feel like some people are just performing in front of a camera. I think it's important for us as citizens to be able to hear what they're saying, but I also feel like some people, I wonder what those meetings would look like if it wasn't like you getting to perform for the United States of America. It's, I mean, on both sides, it has gone a little bit unprofessional and at times, and I definitely think that it probably got rowdy before cameras were existing inside, but I feel like we've gotten to a point where it's very performative. And I mean, even political social media accounts seem very performative in ways where I, it's hard to navigate when politicians are not acting like mature adults and name calling and it happens on both sides. I'm not
Yep,
condemning
yep,
one side or the other, but as nice as it is like yeah, they got him back. Like it's almost like I'm watching like Jersey Shore sometimes when it comes to our politics. And when you think about like these people are leaders. Like this is a leader. I would not accept a leader in my company that I own that behaved that way. So when I'm thinking like these are leaders that make decisions for all of us, it's almost like they're not really held accountable for behaving sometimes like children in those spaces. So it's like, how do we navigate that? Because it does trickle down. When a leader behaves that way, it makes it okay for others to behave that way, and others will take it further than that. That's one of the big things I saw in 2016 to 2020 was we had a leader that was perfectly okay with pushing boundaries of being a bully on his platform, being someone that didn't respect a lot of people. And I saw it being echoed in other people in the communities I existed in, where it felt like they now felt like it was okay to do the things that they were doing. Whereas before, there was like that level of respect, like, this is how you act in public, like, this is not how you behave as an adult in this country. But it's kind of been unleashed, and I wonder if there's a way we can because there are still very respectable politicians out there that are doing a lot of hard work and doing a lot, putting a lot of hours into trying to save like America. But there's a lot of performances going on as well, and those are the ones we know about because those are the ones we see because the media loves them.
Well, and that's like it's opened a can of worms. Um, and then I think it's also what we aren't talking about a ton. It does pop up, but it's like artificial intelligence and like it can look like someone said something and they didn't say it. And so then it just like it adds this extra layer of chaos into everything of being like there's times where I'm like, I don't know if that's real or not. And then you're like, okay, well, I'm gonna make the assumption that it's not real. Um, and but like understanding that that's going to continue to be a challenge. And I think what I'd love to see and what I would have loved to push is accountability of big tech. Um, and like you had mentioned earlier, like bubbles. Like I get it. The goal is to have someone engage with something as much as possible, so they continue to have revenue. But it's a detriment to we just physiologically can't handle that. Like we have not adapted enough to be able to recognize and change that. And I think what we used to have was a news and media industry where it's like here are facts and this is what you're getting. Now it's like this is entertainment. Well, the entertainment has actual impact on how people operate, how our government is functioning. Government should be boring. Like it should be. They should be talking about bridges, and it should not be exciting. Um, it should be about what do people need and what how can we help our country. And I think as the U.S., how can we help the world? We do have a lot of resources here, and I think we do need to focus on helping people here in the United States, but it's also like we do have enough resources to help others as well. And it's again, it kind of comes back to that allocation, and I think there's a lot of waste in how our government is currently operating.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like when it comes to conversations trying to be had in this country, we all assume that we all have access to the same knowledge, but we have to realize, kind of like what you were saying, is the liberals will have the liberal stance news thrown at their face on algorithms, and then the conservatives will have the conservative. And a lot of times people are just fed whatever comes out first from someone's mouth and then never do a check to make sure it was real or to listen in when the person finally comes to and says that was false or I made a mistake. Once something is set into motion, it's almost like no matter what you say to correct it, it's already snowballed effect into something very dramatic and sometimes harmful to the people that it can impact. I mean, the people of Springfield are a great example of people who unfortunately were targeted because of something that was said. And I think that it's important for us as individuals to fact check things that we're sharing. Yes, it may align with our feelings that we have, like, ooh, yeah, this is really going to show the people that the way I think is correct. But if it's fake and not completely factual, like it can cause more harm. And it's just as much as the platform's responsibilities to keep us more informed with real stuff as it is ours when it comes to sharing. I know as my platform grew and I was in front of a global audience, I was put in check multiple times to the point where I started to learn, like, I need to research before I post a quote. I need to understand the person who said it and what they stood for and if I align with it, because
Yep.
instantly, like, there were some people who had good little one sentence quotes, but when you look at who they are and the message that they serve to the world as a whole, it was completely different. And when I started speaking to people from all over the world, I realized that the media was not educating me enough to have an opinion that I should be sharing until I educated myself further. But not everyone takes those steps. And there's definitely conversations where I'm like, I'm going to have to walk away from this conversation because there are facts being spoken on this side and opinions on this side, and they don't work well together. So it's not good energy for me to sit in when I'm debating against fairy tale and real facts. So it's important for people to do those steps. And I think we need to start wrapping that into our education systems of, hey, we are now living in a world where there's lots of things being shown. Anyone can make a website and make it look professional. That doesn't make it real.
Right.
And we have to start educating ourselves to realize that's the world we live in now.
Well, it's even like AI, right? Like AI, you, you hope that it's correct, but it'll make stuff up. And so it's like as that gets implemented into our society and people are using it more, it's like what we've lost our um, we've lost our encyclopedias, I think. Right, like it was always like, okay, if it's in the encyclopedia, it's been fact checked. And just with open access to the internet, I think it's much harder to understand what's real or what isn't. And it's also, as humans now, and as someone with ADHD, like short spurts, right? Like if I don't consume it in 30 seconds, I'm going to get distracted. And the problem with that is when you're talking about these big issues like immigration, it's not a 20-second clip. When we're
Yeah.
talking about the economy, it's not a 20-second clip. Like there are so many inputs into how the economy works or how immigration works or our healthcare system. It's too complex to try to communicate in 30 seconds, but we are only consuming in 30 seconds and like in 30 seconds. So
Yeah.
it's a challenge, but I think that's where we need to be more cognizant, like you said, of what is being communicated. Um, it's an interesting challenge that like we're gonna have to solve very quickly
Yeah.
as our communication structures have changed. Um, and I think really what we need to have is legislators that have this perspective and are willing to go up against big money because it's going to impact big corporations and how they are operating, and what they are allowed to do or not do. And I think that's where we see a lot of gridlock is most people aren't willing to take on the money because the money, well, in our current system right now, like unlimited funds essentially can come against you.
Yeah. And I think to move forward, we do have to start finding ways to collaborate and come up with ideas that, because I feel like we're at a point where there's the Republican way of doing things and the Democrat way of doing things. And it's almost like we keep switching powers and we undo all the work that someone else did, even if it was good for the citizens, because it was the opposite party that did it. And it's like we can't have that. This The Republicans push this, the Democrats push this, and I think it's really important for us to start to say, like, what is the best thing for the American people? It doesn't have to be Republican or Democrat. Like the fact that COVID was so political was sad because we had science saying like this is a dangerous virus that's killing people, but we made it political where it's, if you I went to DC during COVID because we're so close to it, and the amount of people that like flicked me off and called me a Biden supporter because I was wearing a mask. I didn't have a shirt displaying it. It was
Yep.
like I was instantly labeled Democrat because I wore a mask. I was like, I wore a mask because it's protecting me and other people. And it's, I think we've gotten to the point where there's so many things like that, as well as when it comes to just the hatred that's being spewed out. I feel like we're slowly pushing that line further and further to where it's happening so much that it's becoming normalized instead of frowned upon. And it's like they're getting to the point, and I'm the type of person that I do a lot of research and I watch a lot of like historical things and how they happened, why they happened. And I'm like watching how Hitler came into power and seeing how it was just a little bit more, a little like we're slowly pushing the bar to where it's like, oh yeah, let's insult the trans community. Let's insult, it's picking off the small ones
Yep.
first and then going for the bigger one, which would be the women of our country. Like it's that type of actions that I feel like is very dangerous, and I don't think a lot of people realize until it impacts them personally how some of these rules are negatively impacting the whole country, not just the people it was aimed at in the beginning.
Well, and it's one thing that I said on the campaign trail is if they can take the rights of 50% of the population away, they can do anything. And to think like other marginalized communities aren't next is crazy. And it's like it it definitely is a snowball effect, and it's like the floodgates are open, and it's okay. Abortion was first. Next is gay marriage, gay rights. I mean, it's even an interesting tie that I figured out. Well, not figured out, but like kind of came to the realization of was the tie of unions to our our human rights, and we would be discriminated against, possibly not be employed just for being gay if it weren't for unions. And that's where it's like we've seen, especially here in Wisconsin, the deterioration of unions. Scott Walker pretty much made them not possible, which is another reason why we need to take back the state legislature. Um, but it's like to make this more positive is like we know what's going to happen. We've seen the deterioration. Now is the time that we have to be like, okay, we've got to stand up. We've got to push back against the direction that we're going. And I think it's use all the tools that we have to try to fix things and work on things. And I think part of what I like, the game has changed. And I think it's what you were talking about around like, regardless of what side, with Trump being elected in 2016, like the rules changed. And I think that's a perspective that we can't keep operating as like the old rules. And we truly are in a situation where like we need to do what we need to do to make sure that people are protected.
Yeah.
Because if it continues in the direction that we're going, like, I mean, when a presidential candidate is like sharing love for Hitler and wanting his generals, and like that's just not tolerable. Like,
Yeah.
I think that's something that most people can agree on. And so I think it's now being that point of like, we've got to do everything that we can. And it's really why I got more engaged. I actually got engaged in the system. It's kind of one of those like, I'm going to take care of myself. I'm going to take care of my family. Just kind of make my living and try to stay out of it. And it was the Club Q shooting. And that was really the moment for me that I was like, okay, we are going to continue to be slaughtered if we don't do something. And it's asking that question. And I think it's a great question that everyone should be asking of like, what can I do? And that's going to look different for everyone. It's some people, it's going to be like, well, I can talk to my neighbor. That's what I can do. That's like, I've got 4 kids. I've got 3 dogs. I'm trying to work 2 jobs. Like, the only thing that I can do is have a conversation. That's perfect. Like, I think we get overwhelmed and like, oh my God, we have to change the world. But it's all of us collectively doing one little task that adds up to a bigger change. And it's like, we don't run a marathon 1 mile at a time. We run a marathon 1 step at a time.
Yeah.
And that's where there's another analogy that I learned or heard as I was on the campaign trail that really resonated with me. So I went to school down in Madison, and I was in the marching band, and then I had some medical stuff, and so I had major chest surgery, which we can go into a whole nother conversation sometime about our healthcare system, which also kind of drove me to run. But when I physically couldn't be in the band anymore, I actually was asked to join the opera. And so I was in the UW Opera. And it really resonated with me is like, we are a chorus. And how we need to operate is if you need a breath, take a breath. And the rest of the chorus will continue singing. And then when you've gotten your air, jump back in and someone else can take a break and breathe. And I think that's a framework that we need to be looking at, because what we are approaching, what we're dealing with is not just this isn't over next week.
Yeah.
Like there's right, like regardless of the outcome, this isn't over next week, because we still have very distinct ideologies in our country and across the world. And it's there's a lot of work and community building that we need to do, which I know we talked about in the beginning, but and that's really what we're gonna have to do. And so it's like, okay, we're sprinting here, but we've got to have some people like breathing, because it continues the next day. And particularly here in Wisconsin, we are always in election season, it feels like, and it's always the most important election of everyone's life. And it's like, it kind of is. We have another state Supreme Court race coming up in the spring, which could determine the state Supreme Court. And so, like, we start again the next day, and like we've got, it's an important election, so we can't just like sit on our hands. And so that's where I like to talk about sustainability and like how can we take the breaks that we need. And it comes to self-care, whichever, like with whatever that is.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like I have a morning routine. I wake up, I let the dogs out, I drink my pre-workout, I play piano for like 5-10 minutes, and then I go work out, and then I start my day. And it's like, then it doesn't matter. Whatever the day holds, like it can turn into an absolute cluster. But I've still done something for me and like have gotten a little bit of an energy boost. And so that's where like I think we need to encourage people to like, yeah, breathe. Like literally breathe, even if it's a minute a day, like just take a little bit of time for yourself because it's gonna get harder before it gets easier. Um, and I think that's a difficult thing, but it's also we're all in this together, and there are a lot of people fighting. There are a lot of people fighting for people, and
Yeah.
so I think there's there's that encouragement out there, and it's like it's really cool to see communities come together.
Yeah. And I love that you kind of talked about that because I feel like if you are operating in the wrong lane, you will exhaust yourself so much faster than if you operated where your strengths were being used. Um, I am not a fighter. Like I can and I will, but it exhausts me. By the end of having a heated conversation with someone around politics, I will feel drained and need a day or two to recover from that. I'm more of a healer and a speaker in a way of inspiring people and empowering people to be or see themselves as their full potential. So, like, there will be artists, there are coaches, there are like warriors that go out there. Like, all of us can play roles. You just have to find the one that like works for you. And yes, self-care is so important. Like I had to step back because in 2020 I was very aggressive because in 2016 I was terrified to use my platforms to share because
Mm-hmm.
all I heard was Trump, 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 and I was like, I don't want to put myself as a target. And then when that election went the way it went, I was just like, I will never be silent again. Like, I will not allow myself to do that. So in 2020, I really put myself out there and I was just like every single day doing something. And I was having those intense conversations and I was wearing myself out to where my loved ones were being impacted by my negative mood that I brought home. Um, and then this time around, I was like, I'm an inspiring person. I'm a person to have conversations where I instill hope in people who have lost hope. Like, I
Mm-hmm.
can do that. And at the end of the day, I was like, yes, let's do it again tomorrow. But then I fill my cup back up with game nights with my friends, movie nights with my boyfriend, like walks with my dog, hiking in the mountains, kayak trips, bonfires. Like all of those things fill me back up so that I can get back out there and show up as an inspiring person to inspire people to make a change and put their foot forward for the things they believe in, but it required me to understand that. And I don't think a lot of people understand that they get angry at someone who's not showing up as a warrior the way they want them to. And it's like, maybe they are the person who is the healer. They're
Yep.
the person that gives the hugs and encourages the warrior to go back out there after they got wounded in battle. Like maybe these are the writers, the people who write. Maybe they're painting and writing songs. Like there's lots of different ways to inspire and encourage change. You just have to realize not everyone's built the same way, that's okay. And if you allow people to exist in those spaces, and like you said, like what can you do? Think about that and be like, what doesn't drain me? Like, how can I show up? I've been wearing a lot of Harrison Walls shirts around in Richmond, and it's actually made me feel better with the amount of people who like show up and they're like, love your shirt, great shirt. Like, because before I wouldn't see Harris shirts anywhere. I only saw Trump 2024 or Make America Great Again stuff. And it made me feel like I was surrounded by everyone that did not think the same way I did. But when I showed up and put myself out there, the amount of people who came up to me and wanted to have conversations with me, like filled me back up with, okay, there's quite a few people out there still
Yep.
fighting the good fight. So it made me realize that we're probably standing next to allies and people who believe a lot of the same things we believe in. And sometimes we just have to say, hey, I'm here, and people will align
Yep.
with you. And
Yeah.
that's been my case. I've had some eye rolls when they see my shirt, but that's okay. I haven't had anyone negatively attack me. Even when I was in my hometown at a rural like gas station where tons of people were like wearing camo and didn't look like they would support it at all. Like I had a guy come up and he's like, "Love your shirt." And I was like, wow, was not expecting that.
Yep.
But it made me feel good knowing that like I wasn't alone. It's just we're kind of standing in a space where there's nothing that really differentiates us to where we can see, hey, there's someone here with me. That's also why like I put an equality sticker on my car, why I have things that have rainbow on them in subtle ways because I remember as a kid growing up in rural America seeing just a small thing like that made me feel a little less scared of
Yep.
showing up as a gay person in this world.
Well, and that's yeah, and like I said, it's part of the premise of like, especially in rural Wisconsin, the amount of people that I got being like, I never thought an openly gay person would run in rural Wisconsin, and like, thank you, and and older generations where they've had to be silent to survive, but we're getting to a point where it's like we need to stand up and say you're not alone. Like people are fighting for you, and like we can make the change that we want. And yeah, one of my so Fair Wisconsin is an organization here, and they have a shirt and it's like "You are loved," and I think it's in some of my posts, and it's in rainbow and like artistic, and it's one of my favorite shirts to wear because it's like I don't care who you are, like someone like you're cared about, like you're a human, you have value. And the other one that I have been wearing more and more is my big heart one, um, and it just like you kind of get giggles, but it's like it's okay. It's okay to be a little bit of that outlier, and obviously safety is important, and like making sure that you're not getting in situations where there's potential to be hurt. But I think it's also empowering of like challenge yourself to be a little bit uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And then it's like, okay, if that goes all right, you can be a little bit more uncomfortable, but like it's okay to show up um as who you are. And I think that's what I guess I hope to inspire and make sure that others feel that they have a voice at the table. And I think that's also important is like we need to, and if I tie it back to like our government, we need to have a government that's representative of everyone and everyone's voice is at the table. Or
Yeah.
there's an also the understanding of like your voice isn't at the table, but we're going to take your perspective into consideration.
Yeah.
And that's something that I think we can continue to work towards.
Yeah. Until like all of our differences can be on a stage and celebrated, like we have work to do. And I
Yes.
think it's so important to like diversify as much as we can, but if we don't have diverse like leaders, like have educated leaders who understand the importance of a diverse group of people that they serve because we're all unique. We all need different things, and it doesn't make it greater or lesser than a need just because there's more people who need it. There should still be access to things that people need. Just because there's less people with disabilities doesn't mean we take ramps away and only
Right.
have steps. Like, we have to look out for the people who need us the most. And I think that that's something that's beautifully shown through you as a person. And I'm glad that you're a person who's showing up in the political like world. I I think I'm an activist at heart. I could stand for a cause. It terrifies me to think of sitting in like a political space where decisions are made all the time and there's going to be angry people no matter what decision you're going to make. So I think that that's beautiful that you have picked up the torch in that way, because we need
Thanks.
beautiful people with big hearts in those spaces. I love that you talked about your shirts, because I love being a walking billboard with beautiful messages. I grew up with the Life is Good brand that
Yeah,
I thankfully got to work with when I became a person of influence on the internet. But every single brand where it's like stay and suicide awareness and LGBT, like I love getting to work with different brands and be a walking billboard of positive messages. So I'm glad you've got some shirts like that for you to be able
yeah.
to spread it.
Always looking for more shirts too.
Yeah, there's endless brands out there
Yes.
looking for people to wear their stuff and spread that beautiful message. So I see that we got to the end of the hour. So I wanted to say thank you so much for coming on here and having this conversation.
Thank
And
you.
I want to open the floor to you if there's anything you want to end on to kind of share with the people who are watching and who might also watch later.
Yeah, I think the big thing is um, like just just do what you can. I think don't get overwhelmed, or try not to get overwhelmed. Do what you can to make the change that you want. And I mean, I do have to say, get out there and vote, and
Yes.
vote for Harrison Walls. Um, and but just do what you can. And I think also just a sentiment of there are people out there fighting. So even on days that you feel like it's hopeless or it's not, like there are people out there fighting. And there are resources out there too. So I know we're in a challenging time, but um, I am hopeful that we will continue moving forward in a more positive direction. So thank you for having me on. It was great to chat with you.
Yeah, and hopefully we can have a conversation in the future and see where life takes us after election day.
Yeah, yeah, it's gonna be an interesting one.
Awesome. Well, you have a good rest of your day, and I will talk to everyone soon.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.